Do you ever get tired of choosing between the Democrats and Republicans? Why is it that in the United States, only two political parties have a chance of winning elections? In this video, we're going to explain this phenomenon using the unique approach of economists. Welcome to another episode of Planet Econ. In Canada, there are currently 4 parties that control more than 5% of seats in the House of Commons. And in Germany, there are currently 5 such parties in the Bundestag. So how come in the US Congress, there are only 2 parties? In the mid-20th century, a French political scientist by the name of Maurice Duverger wrote down an idea that was already very popular in his time, but later became known as Duverger's law. Countries that run winner-take-all, or first-past-the-post elections, will end up having only 2 political parties with a viable chance at winning. First-past-the-post describes an election system in which voters are divided into different voting districts, and then the candidate that receives the most votes in a district wins the right to represent the entire district. Elections for members of the House of Representatives are first-past-the-post because the person who receives the most votes in each congressional district gets to represent the entire district. And American presidential elections are also first-past-the-post because in 48 states, the candidate that receives the most number of votes in the state gets all of the electoral college votes of that state, and in the remaining 2 states, namely Maine and Nebraska, electoral college votes are allocated to the winner of each congressional district as well as to the overall winner of the state. In such a system, your vote does absolutely nothing unless it happens to tip the balance in your state or congressional district. So it may seem very intuitive that such elections favor large parties. As economists, though, we like to bring math into absolutely everything. And it turns out that there is a mathematical proof for Duverger's assertion that under a first-past-the-post system, the number of viable parties will drop specifically to 2. The gist of the mathematical proof is as follows. Let's meet Pete, a rational voter who lives in a country where there are 3 political parties, with the very exciting names of Party A, Party B, and Party C. See that Pete loves Party A, would feel somewhat okay if Party B won the election, but would feel absolutely devastated if Party C came to power. However, unfortunately for Pete, Party A is the least popular party in his country, and Party C the most popular. In other words, if you randomly select a voter in his country, it is very unlikely that the voter you have selected will vote for Party A, and it is most likely that you will end up selecting a voter who will vote for Party C. Being the rational voter that he is, Pete knows that if, without his vote, in his voting district, parties B and C got the same number of votes, and both got more votes than Party A, he should vote strategically and give his vote to B so that the party he hates the most doesn't win his district. But if Party A got the most votes in the election while tying another party, then he should vote for Party A so that the party he likes the most wins. At this point, you might say, whoa, what if there are no ties between any parties? Isn't that a scenario that's the most likely to occur? Actually, no matter how likely it is for this scenario to occur, Pete doesn't have to consider whom to vote for when there are no ties between any parties, because his vote would do absolutely nothing in that case. And rational voters only care about when their vote might make a difference. So, we know that Pete only cares about what his vote would do when a tie would occur between the 2 parties that got the most votes in the election without his own vote. So now let's only consider probabilities conditional on a tie occurring in an election between the 2 parties that receive the most votes. If, given that a tie occurs between the top 2 runners, the tie has a good chance of being between Party A and another party, then Pete should vote for Party A. But if this tie will almost always be between parties B and C, then he should vote for Party B. You can imagine that which parties this tie occurs between will have a lot to do with the number of voters in Pete's district. If Pete lives in a voting district with 4 voters, then Party A has a decent chance of getting the most number of votes while tying another party despite being the least popular party. However, if Pete lives in a voting district with 760,000 people, then in an election, if a tie occurs between the winning party and another party, it will almost always be between the two more popular parties. So, in real-world elections involving large populations, even avid supporters of Party A like Pete will not vote for Party A. In the end, then, we will only have two political parties with a reasonable chance of winning elections, even though you started with three parties. It turns out that mathematically, even if you start out with more than three parties, a similar argument can be made so that only two parties will amass a significant number of votes. In other words, to use very technical economics speak, as the number of voters approaches infinity, the number of votes received by all parties but the two most popular parties in a symmetric Bayesian-Nash equilibrium approaches zero. See if you can remember that sentence so you can impress your friends at the next party. Indeed, in the real world, we see that many countries that use first-past-the-post elections only have two dominant parties. For example, the Conservative and Labour parties dominate in the UK, and only the People's National Party and the Jamaica Labour Party are represented in the Jamaican Parliament. However, there are exceptions to Duverger's law. While the mathematical proof that we have explored together is rigorous, it rests on certain assumptions that sometimes do not align with conditions in certain countries. You might recall that in the beginning of this video, I mentioned that Canada has four major political parties. Canada also uses a first-past-the-post system, so how come it has more political parties? One of the assumptions that the proof makes is that no small party has very concentrated support in one or more voting districts. It turns out, one of the major political parties in the Canadian Parliament is the Bloc Québécois, which is a party that aims to gain independence for Canada's French-speaking province of Quebec. Thus, it has tremendous support in Quebec, but pretty much no support in other parts of the country. In the last Canadian federal election, the Bloc Québécois won 32 out of the 338 seats in the House of Commons, but gained only 7.6% of the total number of votes cast in the country. So if you hypothetically impose the assumption used in the proof and geographically spread out these votes, you would find that the Bloc would win almost no seats in Parliament. However, it is very clear that the United States is not an exception to Duverger's law. Thus, to do away with a two-party system, America would need to shed the first-past-the-post system for a proportional representation system. In a proportional representation system, everyone's vote always matters, no matter if there are ties or not. For example, Germany uses dual-member proportional representation system to elect members of the Bundestag. In a German federal election, a voter casts two votes. The first vote functions in a manner that is somewhat similar to that of a vote under a first-past-the-post system. It goes towards selecting a winner for one's constituency. Each candidate who wins a constituency via the first vote is guaranteed a seat in the Bundestag. The second vote goes not to a candidate, but to a list of candidates selected by a party. And overhang seats are added to the Bundestag until the number of seats that each party holds, while taking the constituent seats into account, is proportional to the number of votes the party received via second votes. In this system, even though your first vote might still end up doing nothing, your second vote will always affect the outcome of the election. Thus, even though this system is more complicated than the first-past-the-post system, it is much more democratic. It also allows more than two parties to thrive and hence gives rise to the possibility of many different coalition governments. So voters really do have much more choice under this system. Closed-list elections are another form of elections that embrace proportional representation. In a closed-list election, a voter votes for a party as opposed to a candidate, and the seats in the legislature are allocated to candidates on a list put forward by the party based on the proportion of votes each party received. This system is currently being used in Spain, Paraguay, and many other countries. However, you may be wondering, what about presidential elections? Aren't they winner-take-all elections by definition? It is true that switching congressional elections to proportional representation will probably not change the reality that a president will end up being from the two most popular parties. But giving smaller parties a chance at Congress will likely influence the popularity of these parties and thus indirectly affect presidential elections. This effect may be especially important, considering that there is currently a very transparent process for electing the president after each party has selected its nominee, but the process of selecting the nominee for each party is not nearly as clear. All in all, the United States is one of the oldest democracies in the world, so it may be time to update the electoral system so that each vote can truly influence who is placed in charge of the country. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and consider supporting Planet Econ on Patreon. Stay inquisitive, and see you next time!